I hope you obtain an insightful shift in your approach to teaching and learning online whilst participating in our second ALLT online forum. Could I now, excuse me, welcome the first presenter in our panel, which is Mr. Peter Davidson, who's going to speak on what every teacher should know about learning-oriented assessment. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amy. Am I sharing my screen? Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. So if you're wondering where Amy was from, because her funny accent, she's from New Zealand, so that's why she spoke a bit funny there. I actually from New Zealand as well, so I speak a bit funny too. So let's move on. Learning-oriented assessment. So traditionally, we all know that assessment, the purpose of assessment is to measure students' performance, for placement, for progress, for achievement, or for proficiency. However, testing can also be used to facilitate learning, and this has been going on for 20 to 30 years now. In a learning-oriented assessment approach, all assessment contributes to learning. So I've been thinking about, what does this mean for the classroom teacher? How does learning-oriented assessment impact in the classroom? The purpose of this talk is to look at how assessment can be constructed to maximize opportunities for meaningful student learning in the classroom and become an integral part of the learning process. So we'll start off by looking at a table that I created a few years back, and we're not going to go through this whole table, but it's just to this idea was a precursor to learning-oriented assessment. This idea from the 80s and the 90s about assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. So in the left-hand column, we have assessment of learning, which is the traditional test to measure students' learning, gather evidence for standards, quality, accountability. And then as we move right, we have assessment for learning, and we have, it's moving towards things like facilitating learning, assessing the progress, etc. Let's look in more detail at what learning-oriented assessment is. So learning-oriented assessment is an approach, or perhaps some people call it a framework, where all assessment, not just the progress assessment or the summative assessment, but all assessment contributes and helps to facilitate student learning. Carlos, writing in 2009, for all assessments, a key aim is to promote productive student learning. Cambridge Assessment English, the guys who do IELTS, they even talk about learning-oriented assessment emphasizes that all levels of assessment should contribute to both the effectiveness of learning and the evaluation of learning outcomes. And Carol, writing a little bit more recently, talked about learning-oriented assessment is theorized as a development and validation framework for identifying the dynamic interactive relationship between instruction, between teaching, between learning and assessment in the classroom. The learning-oriented assessment framework highlights the interrelationship between instruction, learning, assessment to both foster successful learning and guide the development of learning-oriented assessment. So in a nutshell, learning-oriented assessment is all about trying to maximize learning opportunities for students while they're taking assessment, not just for measurement, not just to see if they pass or fail a course, but trying to use the opportunity of assessment to facilitate learning. So what I'm really interested in when it comes to learning-oriented assessment is how can we actually implement this in the classroom? What can we actually do to facilitate learning in assessment in the classroom? Well, I've broken this up into 3 different sections. What you can do before the assessment, what you can do during the assessment, and what you can do after the assessment. So there are a number of things you can do before the assessment to facilitate learning. It's better to use, so the first thing is think about the timing of assessment. It's better to use formative, ongoing, continuous assessment. That's more likely to promote learning. If you just have one final exam at the end of the course, that's unlikely, that's more likely to facilitate cramming and the learning of facts and not learning. Number 2, you need to think about the number of tasks. So rather than have one large assessment at the end of a course, it's way better to have a lot of smaller, low-stakes assessments throughout the course. That's what I was mentioning before, ongoing continuous assessment. You can use technology. Technology generates, computerized tests generate a lot of useful data, and I'll mention some of that later on, that teachers can use to inform their teaching. And the computerized tests can tag items measuring the same construct. So say you have a grammar test, you can tag all the items related to present perfect. So the students might have got 90% in the test, but they got all the questions on present perfect incorrect. So there's a lot of useful information that a computerized test can tell us. The choice of assessment task is also relevant. Down the bottom here, I've got minimal learning, some learning, and considerable learning, and different tasks. So a final exam, closed test, MCQs, true, false, not a lot of learning going on there. Short answer questions, not a lot of learning. Long answer question, midterm exams can generate a little bit of learning. If you give feedback on the midterm exam and students learn from it, some learning can take place. But over on the right, we're getting more learning taking place with portfolios, essays, progress tests, projects, diagnostic tests, dynamic assessment, task-based assessment, performance-based assessment, scenario-based assessment, and authentic assessment. All these types of assessments are way more likely to generate a learning than what's on the left. Another thing you should do to promote learning in the classroom is have transparency. Tell students when the exam's going to take place, where. Tell students what's going to be in the test. So if you tell students what's going to be in the test, they're going to learn those things, and that's going to promote learning. Tell the students the type of questions. Tell the students how much each question is going to be weighted, so that they know that I'm going to spend more time studying this because it's weighted more than these other questions. What about this? Now you're going to start thinking I'm going a bit crazy here. Show students parts of the test, or even show the students the whole test before you give the test. Okay, so you might think that's crazy. But remember, we're trying to get a bit of a change in thinking here. The purpose of the assessment is to promote learning, not so much the measurement. So remember, this is a low stakes assessment. It's probably done in the classroom. It's to measure progress. So you're giving the students the test, you're showing them the test, and they're going to go away and learn everything on that test, which is what you want them to do. Let the students take the test home. Okay, this guy's gone crazy. One thing I always do before I give a test is I say to students, do you guys want 20 or 30 minutes to revise before the test? And they go, yeah. Huge amount of learning going on during that time. Yeah. Involve students in the assessment process. Let them decide when and where the assessment will take place, what areas the curriculum the test will cover, how long it should be, how it will be, what type of tasks will be used. Get students to help design the assessment rubric. Get students to decide on the test weighting, how much each item is worth. Get students to write the test. This is something I do a lot of. Small, low stakes vocabulary tests. I get them into groups and I get them to write the questions, and then we combine them, and that's the vocabulary test. Get the students to generate answer keys. All of that, even though it might sound a bit crazy, is going to generate learning. What can you do during the test? Not a lot you can do during the test. However, you can make the test open book. If you have an open book test and you make it quite a long test, a lot of learning is going to take place. I used to teach a course in globalization, and we used to have these 1 hour, 20-minute tests quite regularly, once every 2 weeks, and they'd always be open book. And the students would just learn more in that 1 hour and 20 minutes than they did in the whole of the rest of the 2 weeks. Give students access to computers, the internet, dictionaries, course material, the textbook. Let students ask questions during the exam. I'm not suggesting that they say, what's the answer to number 4, but they can ask questions about the definition, about the meaning of words, what do you mean, provide a glossary of terms. Use of peer and group assessment can also, on low stakes classroom tests, can also generate a lot of good learning. By this, what I mean is getting students to do the same test in a peer. So there's one test and 2 students do it together. So they have a lot of discussion, or in a group. Sometimes I even do it as a whole class activity. I say, right, you guys, we're going to have a test, and there's only one copy of the test, and the whole class has to answer the test. I just sit back and let them do it. The amount of discussion is really phenomenal. A lot of learning going on. What can you do after the assessment? Tomlinson suggests asking these questions as a way of promoting learning through reflection at the end of a test. What do you think you've done well? What problems did you have? What are you going to do to help yourself overcome these problems? What have you learned while doing this test? What are you going to do to help yourself learn more from this test? So, and he noticed that he gives these questions marks. I think they add up to about 20 marks. So he actually is giving percentage of the test for these questions.
Sorry, Peter, you have about 5 minutes left.
Oh, I only need 4.5, Amy. Perfect.
Excellent.
Provide diagnostic feedback. This is obviously really key and an important area. When students have done a test or do a piece of writing or do any kind of assessment, giving detailed diagnostic feedback is really important. Especially with writing. I'm a big believer in giving face-to-face, one-on-one feedback to students verbally rather than writing it all down. I need to ask questions. I need to ask students questions. What do you mean by this? Can you think of a better way to write this? And then we identify common errors that the student's making and say, well, okay, I've corrected like a third of it. Can you go away and correct the rest, knowing what you know now? Direct students to additional learning resources. Get students to rate their own assessment. Get the students to mark their own tests. This is an interesting one. Let students redo an assessment. Now, I'm going to talk about this for 1 minute. This is something I do when I'm teaching a writing course, and it's at the beginning of the semester. So we give them a writing assessment. It's worth 10%, and they don't do very well on it. And I've got a criteria, and I sit there with the student, and I go over the test with them, and I go, you know, you did really badly. You got 40%. Look, there's no references. You didn't write any thesis statement. There's no topic sentences. You know, and they get really upset, and they're all crying. And then I say, okay, do you want to have the opportunity to redo the test? Do you want to redo the assignment? They go, yeah. And I say, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to reteach some of the things that you didn't do so well on the test. I'm going to teach you how to do a topic sentence, how to write a thesis statement. And they go, yeah. And they sit there and they listen and they learn everything that I wanted, and they're really highly motivated. Then they redo the test, and I get them to bring the same rating criteria that I've marked in red the first time, and I remark it in green, and it's way more positive. So instead of getting 40, they get 80, huge amounts of learning going on there. Rather than saying right at the beginning of the course, right now we're going to learn how to do a thesis statement, and they go, oh, this is really boring, we've done this 10 times before. Analyze the test path data. So I was talking before about computerized assessment. Test path data, when you're doing a computerized test path data can tell you which students the questions answered first, which questions they skipped and went back to later, how long it took them to answer a specific question, and if they changed their answers. All of those things indicate that a student is not sure about an answer. So if they skip questions, go back later, they're not 100% sure. So they might have got it right, but they're not sure about it. If they're changing their answers, they're not sure about it. So in assessment, it's not just a matter of getting it right or wrong, it's other things as well. And last minute, personalized learning. Identify individual learning needs. Test first, teach, and then test. And give students individualized courses. Assessment provides learners with significant learning opportunities. Learning-oriented assessment has the potential to unleash a myriad of learning experiences for learners. We should not waste this valuable learning opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Peter. It was really interesting and maybe slightly controversial, may I say.
Well, I wouldn't be if I wasn't controversial.